In this video, I'm going to be discussing some of the issues related to the investigation of the County Chester Hospital with Dr. Steve Watts. As stated here, he's a former Assistant Chief Constable who wrote the National Police Guidelines on the investigation of deaths in healthcare settings, so he's almost uniquely qualified to talk about this topic. Dr. Watts has been a pretty fierce critic of the investigation that was conducted by the Cheshire Constabulary, codenamed Operation Hummingbird, and was instrumental in the speech made by Sir David Davis in Parliament, in which he questioned the approach of Cheshire Police to what should have been the investigation of the County Chester Hospital. As I've mentioned multiple times in previous videos, we strongly suspect that it was never an investigation of the County Chester Hospital. It was always simply an investigation of Lucy Letby. And the onus really is on Cheshire Police to prove otherwise now by releasing the documents that Dr. Watts himself has pointed to as being instrumental to the investigation and the direction of that investigation. But in this video today, we're going to be discussing with Dr. Watts some of the important aspects of Operation Hummingbird. So without further ado, I'll get into that.
I've investigated matters where experts have changed their minds a couple of times. It's been understandable because circumstances have changed, or they've seen a piece of academic research, for example, which has influenced their decision, and that's entirely appropriate. As we've identified with, even with the experts that have come forward, there are some people, who have some differences of opinion. That's natural in anything like trying to come to a view around medical issues, particularly when the babies have been dead some time. That their injuries that occurred some time ago, they're just relying on notes, etc. So there can be understandable reasons for oscillations, if you like, in opinions. But if that's not caused by changes in circumstances or information, then that's the time you need to start probing into it.
Yeah. So I did ask Stephanie about the kind of death certificates. And she said, I think, that she thought the cause of death would need to have been changed on the death certificates. I think I'm right in saying that.
She might be right. She might be right. But all I can say is from my position as SIO, I would never really. It was, if you like, always a courtesy, if you like, to deal with the coroner, because at the end of the day, the coroner has a responsibility to understand the cause of death of anybody within their jurisdiction, and I would see it as a courtesy if I was dealing with the death, to go along, brief the coroner, and they would always say, "Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Watts. It's very, very helpful. I'll have an inquest, and then I'll adjourn it until you come back to me. Thank you very much indeed." And I'd ask one of the team, usually a detective inspector, to go along to the inquest and say, Your Honour, this matter is now under investigation. We've got a team of 20 officers working at this police station, and we anticipate that it's going to take some months to come to a conclusion, and we'll keep you updated. And he'd say, "Thank you very much," and it will be adjourned, as they say, sine die, until the next time, if you like. I'm not going to gainsay what Stephanie does, but to me, it wouldn't have been a significant thing what the coroner had written down on the death certificate. That would all be resolved right at the end of the process, when we knew that there'd been a murder, or the person had been acquitted, and we knew it wasn't a murder. And then we'd be going back to the coroner, who would then resurrect the inquest, and then the coroner would decide what the cause of death was. That's been my experience.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's fair. I want to ask you now about the concept of a hygiene audit of the investigation. Firstly, you could possibly explain what that means, and also tell us why that should have been mandatory for this investigation.
I've not heard it called a hygiene audit before. I'm not sure where that phrase has come from, but I think I know what you're talking about. It's a review of the investigation. So the murder investigation manual, the big Bible for how to investigate a murder, is very clear that there ought to be regular reviews of the investigation. And that's in order to confirm that proper structures are in place, that if it's necessary that the home's IT system is being used, that's in place, that the right staffing is in place, the right people are in the right places, the right roles filled. So all those administrative things are there. It's being managed properly. You've got the right framework in place. That the right investigative decisions are being made. There's a forensic strategy. There's an interview strategy. There's a suspect strategy. There's a hypothesis generation strategy. All those things are in place. That you've got the right training for the people. So it's really looking at the whole investigation and making sure that the structure's there, but also that it's been properly led in terms of all reasonable lines of inquiry are being followed, and all of those are being followed appropriately, and all the evidence is being gathered. So that can be in the form of a detective, a senior detective from within the same force coming along and doing it, or another force. So I was, for a while, the vice chair of the homicide working group, which is a national body looking at the investigation of homicide. And one of the roles that we had, sort of informal, was sometimes forces would approach us and say, can we nominate a detective superintendent to go to X force to do a review of this investigation? And we identify somebody and ask them to go there and do it. So they would go to that police force, they'd take a small team of people with them, and they would just, as we used to say, they'd go through it like a dose of salts. They would just go through every document, every decision that had been made. So one of the key documents they'd be looking at would be that decision log that I've described. They'd be looking at all the meeting notes. They'd be dip sampling some of the paper flow. So they might, in a dip sample, find a message that comes in from Michelle Warden saying, I've got some information for you. They then make sure that piece of it, that call generated an action for a detective to go and speak to her. And that detective did go and speak to her. That detective did take a statement. That came back in. That was reviewed. And any relevant things out of that document were then actioned. They follow that paper trail. But because if they came across a message and said, well, hang on, this retired nurse is telling us, that she's got some information. What did you do about it? Oh, we just didn't think there was any point doing it. That would be an issue. That would be a negative comment within the report. So they then produced the report. I mean, the important thing to say is this, although this is a pretty intrusive process in the sense of, the people doing the review should be very rigorous in terms of looking at all the material and speaking to key people within the investigation. It's at the same time designed to support the senior investigating officer. Because sometimes, particularly in complex investigations, you can get quite overwhelmed with the information and the issues you've got to deal with. And I've been in that position myself. You think sometimes, we've got that going on over there, we've got that going on over there. And it can be helpful for an officer of the same position of you who's investigated, similar jobs themselves, to sit down with you and say, have you thought of this? Have you noticed, you've got a bit of a gap over here or whatever. So it's a supportive process as well as, if you like, as you say, a hygiene, make sure everything, is being done that it needs. So for an investigation like this, very complex, very high level of resources, a lot of people involved, very significant, lots of, high profile issues, a national profile, very serious, massive public interest issues. And it had been going for a couple of 3 years. I would have expected that to have been reviewed on a number of occasions. I would expect that to have been reviewed at least once a year, if not a couple of times a year, and I would expect there to be at least one external review. The internal reviews are fine, and I'm not saying there's any inappropriateness because, you might know that the senior officer who was doing it, you may have, there may be close colleagues, that's helpful and that's good. But I think in a job of that size, you'd be expecting to see at least one or two external police forces coming in and doing a very thorough review. And they'd have been asking questions. If I'd have done a review on this, I'd be asking questions like, why are you focusing on this nurse?
Mm.
What have you done about interviewing the doctors?
Yeah.
What are you doing about, these, you've got a lot of evidence here to suggest that it might be sanitary conditions, it might be understaffing, it might be the fact that the doctors are only doing 2 ward rounds a week. What have you done to run that down to identify whether or not that could be the cause? Well, are you happy that this expert that you've got? Are you happy just with this one expert? Why didn't you accept the advice of the NCA to get a panel in?
Mm.
Don't you think you should be asking an obstetrician to have a look at this? So those are the sorts of things that a review should generate. So it's not about going in and giving somebody a bad scorecard. It's about going in and trying to get the investigation done properly, effectively, and robustly, and with integrity. And and I think there's even a case now, because I keep on banging on about this issue of we need to see the key documents. I think it would be helpful for a review to be done on all this material, because all the material's there. It's not going to go away. They're not going to destroy it. And you could do that now. A senior officer from another force, with a team of 4 or 5 people, could come in and they could go through all that material, and they could come out and say, yeah, we think this was all done properly. These things were considered, and the decision to go down that path was reasonable and justified. So, again, we're not going to know until we find until these documents are disclosed to Lucy's defence. And it would be in those one of the issues I looked at again today, in the murder investigation manual, where it talks about reviews, it requires the SIO to make a note in the decision log if they decide not to have a review and why they're not having a review. So if there have been no reviews, we'd expect there to see 4 or 5 decisions within the decision log saying, we don't think it's right at this time to have a review, and the reasons are X, Y, and Z, and we'd be able to identify whether that was a reasonable rationale in the circumstances.
Yeah, I just have a few thoughts on what you said. So I just recently, as I mentioned, recorded analysis, the second part of this film that they've made on Operation Hummingbird. And in this part, there is some comment, and I think there's comment in other sections that I will analyse, but there's comment in this section about, oh, we didn't want to jump to the wrong conclusion. But then everything in that film and everything that we've seen from this investigation, and we know a fair bit now, nowhere near as much as we would like to know, admittedly, but everything indicates that they never really considered any other possibility. They went from, oh, we're not going to investigate because there's no reason to do so, to allowing on the 15th of May, as we've discussed in the past, Brewery and J-Ram and Susie Holt to a lesser extent walk in and say, oh, we're really concerned. And they, to all intents and purposes, they identified Lucy Letby in that meeting. You couldn't have come out of that meeting not knowing which nurse they suspected and the identity of that nurse. There's even some indication they may have said her name, but I think that could be a typing error. But they practically identified it anyway. Then within a couple of days after that, they were already saying to the media, and we've discussed this previously, oh, we're definitely going to investigate this. And it was all systems go. And then I personally have seen no evidence whatsoever that they ever considered any other possibility other than Lucy Letby and malfeasance. And that's evidenced again by something we've discussed today. They didn't want to look at the RCPCH report at all. For example, there doesn't seem to have been any effort to question the consultants. Again, we've discussed that previously. So everything points in the same direction. That's my opinion based on what I've seen anyway.
And we'd be able to confirm that if we saw these documents, because amongst those documents there would be minutes of meetings, so you'd be looking there to see whether or not there was a conversation about whether they should be interviewing the doctors, whether they should be interviewing other nurses, whether they should be looking at staff. There'd be conversations there about, what they think about the medical evidence that Dr. Evans was providing, whether or not they should go. Everything should have been discussed in those meetings. And if there's a decision to do or not do anything, it will be written down, or should be written down, in that decision book. So you'd be able to see the ebb and flow of the investigation, and you'd be able to identify whether they considered the things you're talking about. In my heart, I think they probably didn't, but you're never going to know until you see those documents.
Yeah.
And those are the sort of things, if they had a review, would have been picked up. So if they had a review, 3 months in, they might have had, they'd have had a senior officer saying to them, hang on, you're relying on one doctor, eh? Don't you think you should get some other people in? And don't you think, and actually you've got the NCA here giving you advice. That looks like pretty good advice to me. If I follow you, I'd follow that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, the most, and again, as we've emphasized, we don't know this 100%. It just looks very strongly that this is the case. I think the biggest kind of error, or the one that I find hardest the one I think is indefensible really, is that when the investigation begins, it should be about establishing. They shouldn't be viewing it as a crime. They should be viewing it as a situation that they have to understand, and they didn't do that as far as I can see.
No, the first question is, is there a crime here?
Yeah.
And I don't think they, that they really established that, to a high degree. Well, at any stage, it's clear now there's still question marks over whether there was a crime. Had they got that team together, that panel of experts from different disciplines, they could have made a more rational decision around whether they were dealing with a crime or whether actually they were looking at poor care on that ward or other circumstances. I think, what it appears, looking at it from the outside in terms of the material that's available to us, it appears, as you say, that they assumed it was a crime, and they then had been given an indication as to who the suspect would be, and they followed that route, and they gathered evidence which supported that hypothesis, supported that narrative. I hope if we look at these documents, we'll see that they looked at other areas, but there's no evidence that I can see at the moment that was ever done.
No. So I've got a few more questions that I'd like to ask you. The first one is about something that many viewers will be aware of, that Cheshire Police won awards for Operation Hummingbird. Now, let's just put to one side the actual quality of the investigation. It seems to me they won this award because it was a high-profile case and it was nothing to do with the quality of the investigation. But I know that you're opposed to awards being given out regardless of the quality of the investigation. So could you explain why, please?
Yeah. So this is something that arose whilst I was vice chair of the Homicide Working Group. So the Homicide Working Group is put in place, and it's still a body in the organisation, to develop best practice in relation to the investigation of homicide and also other major crime. The principles, apply. And there was a suggestion that we should have an annual conference, and I was supportive of that. We were trying to drive up professionalism in the way that we managed major crime investigation. And an annual event where detectives came together who've been investigating offences, homicides, come together, share experiences, new learning. We could have presentations from, people in relation to forensics, etc., etc. So it was I thought it was a good idea. As that was being developed and the conferences were being put together, somebody suggested that why don't we have, a gala dinner? Yeah, okay, fine. That's what happens at a lot of conferences. People go away, you're in a hotel or a site somewhere, and there might be one evening where there's a gala dinner. You might have a speaker in, and that's got no problem with that. And then it was suggested, well, why don't we have an awards ceremony? So hang on, I've got some issues here. Firstly, what does that say to the families of the victims of the crimes that we're investigating? That we're at an event where we've had a lot to drink, we're slapping each other on the back, we're in black tie, ball gowns, and we go and stand up, like it's the BAFTAs, and we get an award for, say, SIO of the year, let's say. I said, what does that say? What does that say to the public? What does it say to the families? In terms of the, treating it in such a frivolous way. I said, I'm really, really opposed to it. And the second thing that concerns me is we have an event, we decide this particular team, So second is, how do we decide? How do we know that one particular investigation has been done any better than another investigation? Is it because this particular investigation is more high profile? How do we make that judgment? And we're a public body. Why are we spending time messing around, expending resources to make that decision? The fact is, people are paid to do a job, and they're expected to do a high quality job. The other issue that I was concerned about was, what's our position if we give an award, say the SIO of the year or the investigative team of the year, and 3 months later there are question marks around the conviction? There are question marks around the efficacy of the investigation. There might be allegations in relation to the integrity of the investigation. What position does that put us in? What position does that put the police service in? And I'm really surprised that the media haven't picked up more on this. I suppose they would if they, if we get to the end of this road and Lucy is exonerated, then there might be a question about, was it right for these police officers to be patting each other on the back, wearing DJs and a glass of champagne. On a personal level, I just think it's wrong. On a professional level, I think there are all sorts of problems there, which I've described, and I effectively vetoed it. My feelings were so strong. I said, no, I don't think it's right. And then I retired, and of course, things change after you retire, don't you? So that happened. I was astonished, disappointed, dismayed when I saw it happen. But we are where we are. I don't blame individuals themselves. If somebody's going to offer to give you an award, you're going to take the award, don't you? I just think the whole thing is tawdry. You're investigating the deaths of human beings. You've got families. What would they think if they saw you there behaving in that way? I'm just.
So there's a couple of things I'd say in response to that. Firstly, and I'm not saying this to be unfair, there were some tweets put out in relation to them winning these awards that I just thought were extraordinarily inappropriate, in poor taste, really. I mean, I think I'm right in saying that one of them had the expression "back of the net," like Alan Partridge written in it. Like second win of the night for Cheshire Police. It was that kind of. I mean, I might be slightly wrong, but it was definitely that type of tone.
I've seen stuff like that. I've seen.
I mean, that's just so wrong when you're talking about dead babies. There's no way that should have been communicated, and I understand that, and I know that in the documentary they said, we worked really hard on this investigation, we're proud of our work, and they've got every right to feel that way. And sometimes I feel bad for bashing them so much, because they've been through a lot, and I'm sure they tried the best that they could. But they have to be subject to scrutiny and criticism because of the seriousness of what we believe to be this very unsafe conviction. And then the other thing that I'd say is, you made this comment about, what if the whole thing turns out to be wrong? What if we're wrong and it's challenged, appeal or whatever? So that to me that's a very clear factor in why Cheshire Police have retreated into their shell completely. And I don't know if I mentioned this to you previously, I can't recall, but people who follow the channel closely will know that Cheshire Police tweeted 48,000 times up until December the 8th, 2024, and then they just stopped. And the reason they've stopped is because they know they would be inundated with criticism at this point. It's just the same reason they delete all the comments on YouTube. They're negative.
So Cheshire Police or Operation Hummingbird?
Cheshire, if you go to the Cheshire Police Twitter account or X account, as you're supposed to call it now, you will see that they maintain a very regular Twitter feed. They posted 48,000 times, just normal stuff like You know, there's a traffic incident, just not, like a normal service to the community, and then it just stops on the 8th of December 2024, and they've never posted since. And I suspect they won't post again for several years. Um, and that is because of, I believe, I can't prove this. They could
No,
they
no,
know
I mean,
they
I find that surprising. If it had been Operation Hummingbird tweeting that amount of time, I'd have been, surprised as to why they were doing it. But why the police force as a whole would stop tweeting, community stuff is surprising. Anyway, there you go.
right. Let me put it on the screen for you. Hold on.
I
Um,
don't, I, I don't doubt you what you
I
say,
just
but
want to show you just out of interest. So here it is. Here we go. And here we go. So this is the Cheshire Police, Cheshire Constabulary, the official Twitter account for Cheshire Police. Do not use Twitter to report crime. Here's their post, 48.2 thousand. And this is their last post. Here they are, December the 6th, December the 7th, December the 8th. And then that's it. And it just disappears. And we've never heard from them since. And that we know
surprising.
that they're not saying much publicly or answering many questions or, giving a response to the many inquiries that people
Mm,
have. So I happen to notice this, and I don't think they'll come back for many years because if they,
very odd.
well, I say that I think there's a very clear reason for it. On other platforms, you can control comments that are made, and on this platform, you can't. So
Yeah, yeah.
they would just be inundated with questions, criticism, observations. Why did you do this? Why didn't you do that? You know, and they just couldn't control it. So that's why they've made a kind of, I would suggest, decision to retreat. Um, and we can't ask them whether or not that's true because they don't answer any questions. So I mean, I just wanted to highlight that. And I'm sure
That's
that there must, I mean, so this is another question I wanted to ask you. Do you think there would have been dissenting voices within Cheshire Police during the investigation? And if so, why weren't they taken into consideration? And if not, do you think there will be dissenting voices now?
well. We'd know that if we had access to the minutes of meetings where, detectives might put their hand up and said, actually, are we sure about this, boss? Do we think we're going down the right road? Should we be here, looking there? The only way that would happen would be if the culture was right within the investigation. So firstly, you've got to look at the force culture. Was it as a police force, open and accepting of questioning, challenge, accepting people's views, etc. And I've no reason to believe it wouldn't be because most police forces, try and work in that way. Um, and then it goes to the investigation itself. Did the leadership, the SIO and the senior officers within the investigation, did they put in place a culture within the investigation where people were comfortable and felt supported if they came forward and raised issues, raised concerns, went against, the narrative that they were moving towards. There should have been regular meetings where they actually challenged each other deliberately, and I've done it many times on investigations where I would sit there with the whole team and say, look, are we going down the right path here? Are we making the right assumptions? We think this happened. Are we right? What? How can we test that? How can we treat this as a hypothesis? And the only way you strengthen a hypothesis is by trying to knock it down. So that's really, really important because the only way you're going to investigate anything effectively and with integrity is by ensuring the whole team drives it forward. Because if you move forward on the basis of a charismatic leader surrounded by people who are going to go with that person because of their charisma, because of their management style, because of their leadership style, that's a recipe for groupthink. So you put confirmation bias into an environment where there is groupthink, i.e., everyone agrees with the charismatic leader, then that's a real concern. Again, we don't know whether this happened, but it's a real danger in all organisations, the military, government, in the cockpit of an airliner. If you've got charismatic leaders that are not prepared to listen to other points of view, So I hope
Endangering juries, of course.
in juries, of course, absolutely. And there's been that thing on Channel 4 recently, which I think is really interesting. Where two juries listened to exactly the same evidence at the same time, came to two different verdicts. I mean, that's really, really interesting. And a lot of that was around the characters within the room and the power dynamic. So it's important, for the people leading an investigation, and that's all the senior people in the investigation, to ensure that they're not developing an atmosphere where everybody's going with the narrative that's building. It's about being open to question, open to challenge, and being prepared to listen to what people have got to say. I hope that was position, but we're not going to know until we see those documents.
Yeah.
And we see whether or not there was an open and respectful exchange, and whether there were people, relatively junior people within the investigation who were questioning the narrative. On the basis of what I've seen, the video, etc., I've not seen any evidence of that. Whether there are people now that are concerned, I don't know. I mean, often in these sorts of things, these sorts of situations, over the time, people come forward, don't they, and say, what was actually happening, what the culture was, how they and other individuals felt. I don't know. I mean, none of us can say. None of us can say. The right thing to do would have been to develop, an appropriate, open, inclusive, and listening attitude within the investigation. I hope that happened, but we won't know until we see these documents.
Yes, I wanted to ask you actually, seeing as you mentioned this, so you did use the phrase relatively junior people. So I guess that a police constabulary is quite a small organisation compared to the NHS as an example, but there's still a hierarchy within that organisation. So how good it's a difficult question to answer, and obviously it's very much based on your personal experience, but how good are police constabularies typically at listening to junior people, would you say?
They're far better now than they were when I first joined, and there's been a real effort to be, to develop that, and to see everybody within an organisation as fulfilling a particular role. Those roles might be uniformed general policing constable, they might be detective constable, detective sergeant, and maybe superintendent, detective superintendent. They're roles within the organisation which need to be filled in order to achieve the objectives of the organisation. And yes, people are in senior positions, but they need to have the humility and the openness and the leadership. It's a really important leadership trait, that humility and encouragement of people who work, with you and to you, so they're comfortable and you've got the credibility. So there's a load of work you can see. In particular, there's a guy called Chris Keeble who's worth looking at, who was probably too young to remember the Falklands War in any detail, but he was the colonel in the parachute regiment who parachuted in after one of the colonels was shot. Colonel H. Jones was shot, and he came in to command the regiment. He's done a lot of work around the philosophy of leadership, and one of the important things he talks about is the ethical right to lead. And people will only follow you effectively if they respect you, if they believe you have credibility, and they know that you value them and you listen to them. They'll do what you tell them while you're watching if they think that you're an idiot, and you're bombastic or whatever, but they'll only generally follow you and go the extra mile, excuse me, and work as hard as they possibly can in any particular environment if they have respect for you. So, that's trained at all levels within management and leadership within the police service. And it was probably the case here. Excuse me, but yeah, so it's it's a lot better than it was. And it's a hierarchical organisation, but I don't think it's a rigid hierarchy.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's
sorry, particularly within the investigative domain, and certainly within something like Hummingbird, people are working very closely together for long periods of time. And if you don't have a good relationship, it's dysfunctional, and you can't allow that to happen. So, I'm sure there was probably a good relationship. It's whether or not people felt able to speak up if they had concerns, and we don't.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's encouraging. Hopefully that occurred. Obviously, we don't know whether there were dissenting voices, but it'll be interesting to know. The
But
last,
you mentioned earlier on about, I think it's people work really, really hard doing what they thought was right,
Hmm.
and if they put all these frameworks in place, if they consider all these issues that we talked about today, then I'll be very pleased to see that. It's just my concern is we don't see any evidence of it at the moment. And my concern is we've got to a position where all of this evidence has been put before the court and the proper checks and balances haven't been put in place. And it's like the holes in a Swiss cheese. If you get a hole that goes all the way through, it's like, airplane crashes. It's about having something that stops the hole at regular intervals. There's a stopgap there that means that there are checks and balances.
I mean, there were certainly enough opportunities to stop this. That not just for the police, but I mean, I made that video recently, and I know you've seen it. There were countless opportunities where this could have been stopped. It's incredible actually that it just everything lined up as it did, and tragically, we're in the situation we're in now. Lucy, more importantly, Lucy is, and but I suppose it's just water under the bridge, and we just have to move forward.
No, I mean, from the investigative point of view, the big ones were, the Crown Prosecution Service. I'm astonished that they decided to charge, and then it went before barristers. I'm astonished that they didn't. I know that their job is having been instructed to prosecute, but it may well be that they pushed back. And then you get to the judge, the application at half time, if you like. There's the opportunity for the defence to make an application, no case to answer. I'm amazed it wasn't, the case wasn't kicked out at that point. And then really astonished. Well, not astonished with the jury, because I think the jury were in a really difficult position because, certainly the prosecution barrister did a really, really good job of persuading them of the prosecution point of view. And we both agree that we can't understand why an eminent QC, Casey, for the defence didn't deploy witnesses to refute the witnesses of the prosecution. But anyway.
So I've interviewed Steve several times, once with Stephanie Davies, who's been on the channel recently as well. And we've discussed all manner of the police investigation. I'm sure that I will have him on again in the future. He's obviously playing an important role in highlighting the problems with the way that the whole scenario was investigated, which I believe to have been fundamentally flawed from day one, pretty much. Certainly from the 15th of May meeting between Dr. Stephen Breary, Dr. Ravi Jairam, Dr. Susie Holt, and Paul Hughes and Nigel Wenham from the Cheshire Constabulary, it seems that it does appear very strongly that Cheshire Police completely lost all sense of objectivity and allowed the consultants to guide them towards the investigation of Lucy Letby. With that being said, thank you for watching, and tomorrow I'll have more words from another expert on a different area of the debacle that is the conviction of Lucy Letby. Thank you for watching.